is for our debt service costs to be lower than nominal growth. And what we see over here, certainly since about 2010, maybe more pronounced from 2013, is debt service cost increasing much faster than nominal GDP growth. Next slide, please. So I think it's important to contextualize the fiscal framework and the implications. We've seen multi-notch credit rating downgrades for several countries across the world. So South Africa is not on its own in this respect. However, it should be noted that South Africa was on a rather tricky trajectory prior to this, with debt service costs increasing, and we've had relatively weak anemic growth, if you like. What's important now is for expenditure to achieve two objectives. One being the responding to the health crisis, but also one responding to the economic crisis. Now, economic crisis obviously means livelihoods. It means preventing malnourishment. It means reducing poverty to the extent that this is possible, and obviously requires a strong thrust on the part of government in terms of expenditure to save the economy from worse implications in year 2, year 3, and beyond that period. Thank you. Next slide. I'll hand over to my next colleague.
Good morning, honourable members. I'm Nelia Orlandi, and I will take you through the expenditure slides, in specific showing the changes to the spending priorities for the current financial year. So before the crisis, the focus of government was to strengthen the macroeconomic framework, spending on education, health and social development, and they also wanted to modernize network industries and restructure our state-owned enterprises. The focus was also on opening markets to trade in the rest of the continent, and also to implement a reimagined industrial strategy, lowering the cost of doing business and on job creation sectors such as agriculture and tourism. So now, in terms of the pandemic, the central priority is now to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic, and the focus now is mainly on frontline services such as health, social development, peace and security. In terms of primary health, governments prioritize public health to save lives, scaling up capacity in the public health service, and contracting of private hospitals to supplement public sector capacity. In terms of social development, the government will scale up and maintain social assistance, interventions for distressed and vulnerable households, reprioritize funding to prepare social facilities for safe reopening and service delivery, and they will also fund psychosocial services for people affected by the pandemic. In terms of peace and security, increased deployment of the police service and National Defence Force during the lockdown, and other departments will also have to require reprioritization of fundings to roll out their own responses. The presentation is not showing, so I'm not sure if Alan has got problems, but the next slide.
Sorry, Nelia, somebody took control of the screen. If that person can just give control back to me, I don't know what happened. I'm also trying to reload the presentation.
Okay, but I can, in the meantime, I can continue on slide 16. So in line with the policy priorities are the reprioritization of funds. When we look at the table on the bottom line, you can see the change to the non-interest expenditure amounts to 36 billion, of which 19.6 billion is a provisional allocation. Okay, slide 16. The proposed upward expenditure adjustments amounts to 145 billion, and the proposed downward expenditure adjustments includes National Department's baseline suspensions of 4 billion, the repurposing of provincial equitable shares of 20 billion, provincial conditional grant suspensions of 13.8 billion, and local government conditional grant suspensions of 12.6 billion. The proposed upward expenditures on the right-hand side of 145 billion, you will see it mainly goes to support vulnerable households for 6 months in terms of conditional grants. Health increased by 21.5 billion, support to municipalities amounts to 20 billion, and other frontline services 13.6 billion. Basic and higher education will increase by 12.5 billion, and then support to public entities increased by 5.9 billion. In the bottom section, you will also see in the supplementary budget, there was also an appropriation towards the land bank of 3 billion. Next slide. This slide shows further detail on the National Department's baselines. So the further detail on the suspensions, if we look at the bottom line, you will see that 97.7 billion has been suspended, and it has been and 121.3 billion has been reallocated, which gives us a total net effect of 23.6 billion. The departments that receive the biggest share of the reprioritized funds is corporate governance of 10.9, National Treasury 9.3, Health receives 2.9 in terms of the reprioritization. Social development, the net effect of the reprioritization is 25.5 billion, Defence 2.9, and agriculture police increased by 3.7 billion. Next slide, please. So the suspension of baselines in terms of the economic classification includes changes to the compensation. You see that 1.4 billion has been suspended, of 812 million has been allocated in terms of goods and services. 7 billion has been suspended, of almost more than that has been reallocated. At the bottom, you can see the payments for financial assets. It increased by 13 billion, and that is the allocation towards the land bank. Next slide. So, what does all these suspension of baselines actually mean in practice? In terms of compensation, departments indicated that they will suspend the filling of vacancies. 15 departments actually decreased the compensation budgets, and 3 increased the compensation budgets. In terms of the allocation to local government, the increase in the equitable share will support municipalities with the increased expenditure related to the provision of services, including shelters for the homeless. In terms of the conditional grant, most of the departments indicated that planned projects will be developed. Unplanned COVID-19 interventions, such as the provision of basic services in municipalities. The school infrastructure backlog grant and they indicated that some of the planned projects will be postponed. And in the school infrastructure grant, 600 million has been reprioritized in terms of to allocate funds for water and water tanks in 3,200 schools. A portion of the restitution payments is likely also to be postponed due to the restrictions on economic activity. And then the last one on the slide is fewer farmers will be supported due to the restriction on economic activity. Next slide, please. So in terms of public corporations and private enterprises, allocations for incentives will be suspended by postponing activities to the next financial year and reduce support to firms. However, 500 million is reprioritized towards firms that are in distress as a result of the restrictions on economic activity. Also to note is the reduction in transfers to the Passenger Rail Agency of South Africa of 1 billion. This was in the rolling stock fleet renewal program, and revenue has been allocated to support the Passenger Rail Agency, and also there was revenue support to the South African National Roads Agency of 2.8 billion. Next slide. The next slide is showing the reprioritization of the 20 billion within provinces towards health, and this is as follows. Eastern Cape increased their health budget by 2.6 billion, Gauteng 2 billion, KwaZulu-Natal also 4.1 billion, Limpopo increased their health budget by 2.3 billion, and lastly the Western Cape increased their health budget by 2 billion. But also to note is that the 20 billion, that increase in health budget, only 15 billion has really gone into the health sector and 5 billion towards other functions towards the needs of COVID. Next slide. So, look at the net changes, municipal infrastructure grants. The 20 billion settlement development budget, only 15 billion has really gone into
Point of
the
order.
health sector and 5 billion towards other
Chair.
functions.
Sorry, there's a huge background noise. The sound is very unclear. Could you just tend to that, please?
Yeah, sorry, I've just muted everybody. So, Nelia, just check if you, if I didn't mute you as well.
Can you assist there with the sound, or else we'll have to get Dr. Jangis or Mohammed to take over, because we are running out of time, even in terms of PBO presentation.
Chair. Sorry, there's a huge background noise. The sound is very unclear.
Within the education
Could you just tend to that, please?
6.6 billion has
Yeah, sorry, I've just muted everybody. So, Nelia, just check if you, if I didn't mute you as well.
Net reduction in the education infrastructure fund.
Can you assist there with the sound, or else we'll have to get Dr. Jangis or Mohammed to take over,
and
because we are running out of
16
time,
billion
even in
has
terms
been
of PBO
reallocated,
presentation.
which indicates that
Sorry,
there was a reduction of 10.7 billion in terms of conditional grants. Next slide. 6.6 billion has
Yeah, sorry, I've just muted everybody. So,
outcomes of the
Nelia,
immediate
just
response
check
to
if
the
you,
pandemic shows that
if I didn't mute you as well.
net reduction. Next slide.
Can you assist there with the sound, or else we'll have to get Dr.
Billion has
Jangis or
been
Mohammed to take over,
and
because we are running out of
16
time,
billion
even in
has
terms
been
of PBO
reallocated,
presentation.
which indicates that there's still a large, at that stage there was still a large stock with 17 billion in testing. Additional funding for the PPEs is required.
Yeah, sorry, I've just muted
Preliminary
everybody.
outcomes of the previous slide that I'm on now.
If I didn't mute you as well.
And then in terms of social and basic
Can you assist there with the sound, or else we'll have to get Dr. Jangis or Mohammed to take over,
6.2 million
because we are
were
running out of
paid.
time, even in terms of PBO presentation.
In terms of municipal allocations, the 20 billion by the mid of June, only 5 billion of the 20 billion was spent. But this phenomenon can also be because of the difference in the financial years depending on national, provincial, and the local government. In terms of social and basic In terms of salary income, the UIF by 96.2 million, 355,000 out of 2.4 million employers has been paid, and by 97 million at 5 million of the first to 3.7 million workers. That means that 60% funds has been spent by mid-June. In terms of the business loans guarantee, in terms of 3 weeks delay between announcements and final admission of the program, the UIF actually by 96.2 million workers, and usually low uptake of the 2.4 million employers has been paid. And by 97 from the business side, there was no uptake of the business loans, but the reserve funds actually indicating that our measures has been increased. In terms of next slide, between announcements and so the question remains if government response is adequate. And usually low uptake of the 2.4 million employers has been paid. From the business side, there was no uptake of the business loans.
I can't hear anything.
Sorry, Neely, I muted everybody again, so just unmute yourself, please.
How many slides, PPO, are you left with? Because you are left with 5 minutes to present. PPO, Dr. Mohammed, Dr. Junkis, how many slides are you left with?
Hello, Chair. So we have, I think, 7 slides or so to conclude. Not many more than 7 slides. I think my section, just quickly, let's probably quickly move to...
Can you order Dr. Mohammed take over? Because she seems to have a problem of connectivity. So that in the next 4 minutes, you are done with the presentation.
Thank you, Chair. I think these slides, just to try to stimulate discussion whether the current government response is adequate, given the extent of the situation. I think move to the next slide quickly. Of course, we've taken into account what has been actual response in fiscal responses, mainly the needs and some of what we've seen as some of the challenges. Can you guys quickly move to the next slide, to the revenue slide? I think what we're trying to say here, Chair, that the COVID-19 and related shutdown, economic shutdown, is expected to weigh heavily on revenue, as you've seen, how much has been projected to be declined in shortfall in revenue there, also in the current year, and also it's expected to affect the outer years as well. I think what we'll do, Chair, and members in the TPS will provide some, estimates to look at what some of the estimates based on the current collections. And the main thing, what leads to the shortfall is the COVID-19 fact that government has provided relief on taxes, and largely the expected loss of jobs, which lead to lower revenue from VAT, and also lack of much needed demand in the economy, and closure of business would definitely lead to shock in the revenue, given that more than 80% of the revenue comes from government from taxes, from income and consumption taxes. So any effect that would definitely affect the collections, revenue collections in the current year and outer years as well, which put more pressure in the system. And I mean, certainly the point there is that we see that any poor growth than what is expected will lead to further contraction in tax base in the current year, and given that the 204 also includes the 26, self-induced 26 billion relief from government, and 278 billion will be largely. Chair, am I audible? Hello, Chair?
Yes.
All right,
you are
thank
audible.
you. Yes.
Can you just gallop?
Okay, next slide. The slides are not moving. That's why I'm worried. The slides, next slide. And I think this slide, it also shows that the government active scenario assumes that there will be additional taxes over the years to raise 40 billion starting from the next year and medium terms going forward. But I think what we also wanted to highlight is that even before the COVID-19 related challenges on revenue, there were already efficiency challenges in the tax collections. When you look at the cost to collection revenue, the cost to collection ratio has been declining over the years. So I think that also requires much attention in this regard. Next slide, please. This slide just shows the measures that are proposed by government to provide some relief. 3 points on to make there. One, that largely try to support business to pay more people, to make sure they continue paying people or keep people in the payroll, which will prolong some of the socioeconomic challenges. But also, government had proposed some measures to try to broaden corporate tax base earlier in February. Those measures have been also delayed to try to keep business back in business and support the businesses. But also, government has provided some incentives to anybody who contributes to the Solidarity Fund, try to bring more incentivized people from contributing to the fund. But I think what the point about the slide is just that at the stage, the uptake of this relief is not clear, but we've seen in the reports, in media reports, that informal businesses and SMEs have struggled to access some of these funds, most of those who are in rural area. Next slide, please. This slide here, the next slide, just try to show some of the collections since the opening on the beginning of the year, and we've seen that the low demand economy is way heavily on the domestic VAT collections, and of course PAT will still have to see some of the shocks in the system. But I think the COVID-19 tax relief has meant to try to balance the to make sure that maintain some of the collections from the PAT. Next slide, please. The next slide. I think in February, what we have had, government had proposed measures to try to broaden corporate tax base by reducing some of the expenditures. But we thought we just provide a general overview of some of the tax expenditure, which will also give more context from that. How much tax expenditure are there, which largely comes from the PITs, which is coming from retirement and medical aid, medical support to households, and so on. And we've seen that over the 3 years period, the tax expenditure has been on average 200 billion, and over the years, and it's been increasing quite a lot. I think that's one of the reasons why government tried to review some of the tax expenditures, and I think we wanted to highlight that the Commission should take that into account going forward. Next slide, please. I'm just going to rush through. Then the next section, what we wanted to do as well, you realize that, Chair, that as part of the major part of government's COVID response sees local government as a sector as a very important stakeholder in this regard. As we've seen over the past 3 months, some pressure on some of the municipality to be able to provide basic services, but also cope with some of the COVID-19 reliefs support in that regard. And what has government provided over the past 3 months is some budget policy and legislative measures to try to support local government to respond to COVID-related matters, challenges, by maybe allowing some shifting of budget and so on. There's been some of the measures being provided from government in that regard. And I think it requires the legislature, parliament to also pay attention in those measures and more oversight to ensure that the local government does deliver on supporting government in this regard. I think the slides, what we have here, we're trying to highlight some of the financial performances of the local government within the 9 months of the current financial year. By the end of the March 2020, where we've seen that the collection has been in par with the previous collection of revenue has been in par with prior years in this regard. But metros have actually experienced quite a slight decline in the collections by end of March, and also in expenditures, where we've seen the expenditure has been largely in line with the prior years. But of course, in metros, we've seen some slag also in expenditure over the current financial year, over the current financial. Next slide, please. And I think also what we want to emphasize here, it's realizing that expenditure. Of course, I'm moved to the next slide. The big issue also coming out from the capital expenditure on aggregate has been quite slow. Slow spending as has been over the years, and we've seen more sharper slow spending also in the metros on capital expenditure. Of course, that could also be accommodated. I mean, the impact of COVID has not really come in these numbers. We probably expect some of the impact of COVID coming later in the year, because the the COVID lockdowns that went through the current year of the municipalities. So these are the just indications prior to the COVID-19 lockdowns. But I think it's quite important to highlight some of the situation to understand what are the issues in the local government. And I think the next slide, which is the last slide there, the next slide highlights some of the issues that were highlighted by AG last week in the LCOP, which shows some of the governance challenges in many local governments in the country. And I think the reason for highlighting these things, Chair and all members, is to emphasize how much these have been recurring. Most of these measures have been recurring measures, and more poorer provinces, municipalities requiring more immediate interventions in support. As some lack funds, they're running on deficits, some can't collect funds. There are some of municipalities are running with, the last slide please, that are running with they are going on ongoing concerns. Non-compliance legislation is key. I think the point, I want to conclude with, Chair, is that the point around this slide on local government is just to emphasize that just budget allocation in alone is not enough in supporting local government. There probably more needs of monitoring and of implementation of some of the measures related to COVID, and provide many municipalities needs capacity, both human and institutional capacity support in implementing these measures, and also address some of the key recurring governance measures will also be important as the committee going forward in this regard. Thank you so much, Chair. I really apologize for going over the time. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks very much, Dr. Jantjies, Dr. Mohammed, and Nadia, BO, for their presentation. Members, over to you. Comments, questions. Alan and Fululeko, you will assist me with the members who will want to raise questions. You will write their names here on the platform, also raise their hands. The platform somewhere here. Yeah. Assist me with identifying speakers. Members who want to raise questions for clarity, comments, you can do so. Honorable Louis.
Thank you, Chairperson. Good morning, and good morning, colleagues. Good morning, Dr. Jantjies. I like the beard. I just wanted to ask you, if you go to your slide number 16, givers and takers, you've said here that basic and higher education is getting 12.5 billion more. But if you go to the very next slide, number 17, you're saying here, it looks to me that they're getting a 12.5 billion rand decrease if you add up the net change to basic and higher education. So I just want to see where you get these increased allocations from. The same if you go to health. You've said here that health is getting 21.5 extra. Social development 25 billion. So what I think you might be doing is adding up the provincial changes as well. But I just want to ask whether that's the correct approach, because obviously it's actually for the provinces to decide how they reprioritize those budgets. So as I understand it, the provinces must still present adjustment budgets in the coming weeks. So can you just explain those allocations to me, just as a question of clarity? Thank you.
Thanks, Honorable Louis. Dr. George.
Thanks for the presentation. I can't remember the slide it was on, but it looked like you were predicting a V recovery for the economy. So obviously we saw quite a steep decline in 2020 and then a very firm V upwards in 2021. How certain are you? I mean, obviously it is difficult to make projections, but I mean, what are the indications that we are going to have that V? Because, you know, obviously it would be good to see, but I'm a bit skeptical as to whether that is actually going to happen. So could you maybe just explain a bit on that in terms of your projection? Thanks.
Thanks, Dr. George. For now, those are the two questions and comments that I have. Dr. Jantjies, Dr. Mohammed, Nelia, you can respond.
Thank you, Chair. I think Dr. Mohammed and Dr. Nalindi will respond to that. Thank you.
Respond to Honourable Hill Lewis's question. I can respond to Honourable George's question now. The numbers that we're presenting are not PBO's forecast, but they're based on the projections that we're seeing from other institutions such as the IMF, the World Bank, and including the South African Reserve Bank and National Treasury, plus a few other kind of institutions. So those are the predictions that they have put forward, and we have either used the median increases projected, or we've presented National Treasury figures. Thank you. There was a trouble with sound, so I don't know if I missed another part of the question, but I'll hand over to Nelia for the first question by Honourable Hill Lewis. Thank you.
Siraj, I was offline until now, so I didn't get any of the questions. Sorry.
Honourable Hill Lewis' question was about I just want to get the slide numbers correct. I apologize. Unless Honourable Lewis wants to repeat his question, it may be better if he repeats it.
Yes, I'm happy to. If you just go to slide 16 and 17, Nelia.
Yes.
You see here that we get 21 billion more, and basic and higher education is getting 12.5 billion more. But I'm just asking where those allocations come from, because if you go to the next slide on 17 and you look at the total net change, you see that actually basic education and higher education are actually dropping by just over 12 billion, and health is only growing by 2.9 billion. So what I think you've done, I'm just guessing, is that you've included the provincial reprioritizations here. But the point I was making was that governments decide how they reprioritize their budgets, and they must present adjustment budgets. So I just want to check where those numbers come from. I don't understand them.
Okay, the health increase is 21. The 20 is the reprioritization, basically, within the provincial health departments. It was a reprioritization. And the same with the basic and higher education. It was a reprioritization of 12.5. But if we can continue with the questions, I can, in the meantime, get the exact items or the exact programs that were reprioritized in terms of basic health and education. So how the Treasury has structured this and the new terminology, sometimes it basically indicates that it's additional allocations, but it's basically just a reprioritization of allocations, whether it is within the sector or within a department or between departments. It's basically the reprioritization of 145 billion. It's not additional funds. So some of the money has been taken, especially in education and health. They were one of the givers and takers. So it's not a net effect in most of the cases. and it's not new funding. But I will go down to the detail and I will provide that to you as well in terms of the basic education. But health, if you try and reconcile with the 20, it's definitely the 20 reprioritization within provincial departments, and then the National Health Department also reprioritized.
Okay, thanks, Nelia. Those are the responses from PBO in regard to questions asked by Honorable Lewis and Dr. George. Can we move to the next presentation by FFC? Professor Plakis, are you ready?
Good morning, chairpersons and honorable members.
I'm so sorry to interrupt you, Professor. I just want to, before we move off, Chairman, I would just appreciate if if Miss Orlandi can send me those details in writing. I think she has my email address. I'd be very grateful.
Okay.
Yes, I will.
Okay, thanks, Louis and Nelia. Prof. Plakis, you can continue.
Thank you, Chairperson. Good morning, honorable chairpersons and honorable members. Before we start, I just want to introduce the new commissioners. We got the deputy chairperson of the commission that's in this meeting is Professor Michael Sachs, Commissioner Elsabe Rockman, and also a new commissioner Sikumbuzo Kowani was recently appointed by the president. So we're now full house. In this meeting, we also have Commissioner Aubrey Makari, Commissioner Lawrence Erasmus, and Commissioner Professor Trevor Fowler in this meeting. So, Chairperson, you would appreciate that in this session that we will allow the other new commissioners and also to answer some of the questions that I normally with the researchers needed to answer, but we're now full house. So without any further ado, I would like to ask Eddie Rakabe to take you through the slides from the beginning till the end, in the interest of time. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks, Prof. Plakis. Let me officially also welcome the newly appointed commissioners. Welcome, colleagues. You will be working with us for the next 4 years. I know some of them. I worked with the Honorable Trevor Fowler for quite some time in our previous lives in local government. And I know other commissioners. So commissioners, feel welcome, and we really value your input. So feel free to field questions when members ask us clarity-seeking questions and also comments. So you are officially welcome. Prof. Plakis, you can continue.
Thank you, Chair. I'm handing over to Mr. Rakabe, the person that took the lead in pulling this response for the commissioners together. Eddie?
Good morning, honorable members. Good morning, Chairperson. Thank you very much. I'll be taking you through the presentation. I'll try to be very brief, as the PBO has already touched on some of the slides that we're going to be talking to. Just as a way of introduction, I think the health and economic state of disaster that we find ourselves in has necessitated the drastic adjustment of the February budget to respond to the crisis. And as we may very well know that the Minister of Finance is empowered by the PFMA to table an adjustment budget when the fiscal targets are compromised by unforeseeable fiscal and economic events. So the adjustment was really necessary to mitigate the downside COVID-19 healthcare, the socio-economic risk. But the point that we really want to highlight here is that government was really forced to make drastic changes to the budget within a very short period of time. And this sometimes makes it very difficult to follow a systematic reprioritization framework that is growth in enhancing. Next slide, please. Next slide. The next slide is just to indicate that the Commission is making this submission in terms of Section 2142 of the Constitution, but it also should be seen as a continuation of some other submission that the Commission has made to Parliament, especially the recent one being the one on the 10th of June to the Select Committee on Appropriations. Next slide, please. The presentation outline. Firstly, we look at some of the things that we've mentioned during the presentation to the Select Committee on Appropriations. Then we briefly look at the macro and fiscal outlook. We want to spend time there, the changes to the fiscal framework, the budget reprioritization, and some implication of reprioritization for the division of revenue. Next slide, please, which is slide 6. Slide 6. If the members of the committee recall, I think on the 10th of May, when the Commission was requested to make a submission on the implications of COVID-19 to the budget, what we noted there was that the GDP growth in 2020 was expected to contract significantly, and as a result, we felt that there was going to be really a fiscal and monetary policy interventions that is commensurate with the magnitude of the economic contraction. At the time when the President and the Minister of Finance made announcement, I think our assessment, we could find that only 95 billion of the 500 billion that was announced as a relief could be considered as a stimulus, especially because we could not find any significant deficit spending or tax reduction. As a result, that we pointed out that the only 95 billion could only be regarded as a stimulus. Another thing that we pointed was the need to release the relief package rapidly into the economy, especially to ensure that some of the businesses don't really don't collapse. And as the PBO has already indicated, that we've encountered serious delays in the release of the relief, and as a result, I think some businesses are now finding themselves struggling. Next slide, please. We also noted that the government should reconsider the fiscal consolidation stance, but on condition that the spending increase will be directed at social relief in the short run, and in the long run to induce growth. But we also mentioned that the relaxation of the fiscal consolidation must be accompanied by robust reforms focusing on fighting corruption and improving governance, reducing high levels of concentration in the economy, basically just to focus on the reforms that the Minister of Finance have announced in the reforms policy. Next slide, please. Slide number 9. Sorry. On slide number 9, I think the PBO have already spoken to this. I'm not going to spend time on it. We all know that the global and local economic growth outlook is very green, and what is going to be required is unprecedented fiscal and monetary policy interventions to boost the economy just to its pre-COVID-19 growth trajectory, which was already very, very muted. Next slide on the credit rating. The point really what we want to make here is just that the deteriorating fiscal position is going to make the cost of borrowing increase very drastically, and also also be unable to raise funds to meet the borrowing requirements. So basically, what has happened is between February and now, we've had these downgrades, and that really is going to affect the ability of government to even raise further revenue to deal with some of the social needs, and also it's going to increase the debt servicing costs. Next slide, please. The next slide here just indicate the debt problem and the deficit problem. We all know the ministers have spoken about this one, and even the PBOs have already indicated this one. But really, what the point we'd like to highlight here is that our debt reduction and debt stabilization targets are becoming increasingly elusive. With every budget that is being tabled, we find that the target that we set for reducing the debt we're not able to meet those targets, especially because we find ourselves in this uncertain economic environment that is making it difficult to meet our debt reduction targets. And in the absence of near economic recovery, government is going to have to embark on drastic expenditure reforms in order to stabilize the debt and enhance growth. When the minister tabled the adjustment budget, they also indicated that about 230 billion in expenditure will have to be cut over the next 2 years. But I think what we're indicating that there is that there's a need for delicate balance in expenditure reduction and meeting basic needs. So as we reduce expenditure, at the same time, there's also a need to make sure that we don't necessarily find ourselves where the critical social services that needs to be delivered are being compromised. Next slide, please. The next slide, just to speak to the whole issue of public expenditure and economic growth. We really know the importance of public expenditures to economic growth, and the expectation is that as and when government increases public expenditure, it will also impact on growth. But from the assessment that we have found, even some of the studies that we found, is that the direction of causality between expenditure and economic growth in South Africa rather from economic growth expenditure. In other words, in other words, economic growth drives government expenditure. So from a policy perspective, this would mean that government would necessarily have to focus on creating a more conducive environment for growth, particularly targeting the growth enhancing sector. This speaks to the whole issue of the reforms that are necessary to start to really start making sure that the economy grows faster. The next slide is just to indicate that the unemployment situation in the country is worsening, as we have seen with the recent statistics published by Statistics SA. 38,000 jobs were lost, and a further 306,000 new entrants in the labor market could not find jobs. Again, these are the implications of the COVID-19, but also we continue on the unemployment increasing trend that we've been experiencing over the years. Next slide, please. The next slide, which is more of a positive but also a negative, it's just to indicate that here, many of the people who are losing their jobs right now are professional and technicians. So these are highly skilled individuals. The good thing is that skilled people are more likely to recover much quicker than the unskilled people. So even if they lose their jobs, so the chances are that as the economy recovers, those people, because they've got the skills, they are more likely to gain employment. The bad, of course, here is that the sectors that are traditionally known to create, such as finances and community services, are the ones which are shedding jobs. So there's a need, obviously, to really start to understand why are these particular sectors, such as the community social services, which is where government is really focused at. Why are we losing quite a number of jobs in that area? The last slide on get the price data, which in the sense that at least even with the COVID-19 pandemic crisis that we find ourselves in, the price has been relatively stable. But it's also a reflection of the fact that the demand has been very low. People are not buying goods and services, which obviously may also contribute to recession in the long run. Much faster. The next set of slides focus on the fiscal framework. I will not spend much time on it because the PBO has already spoken to it. Next slide. Yeah, this slide, which is on 17. Sorry, slide 17. Slide 17. Yeah, slide 17 here. I think the main point that we really want to drive is the deficit that we're talking about, the debt that we're talking about, is mainly driven by the decline in revenue. So as and when the revenue decline, we continue to see this burgeoning deficit, and which is not necessarily a result of runaway expenditure increases, but because the revenue is not catching up with the rate at which the expenditure. So this is really the point that we drive. As long as the economy is not growing, revenue is picking up. We are likely going to continue to see this wedge between expenditure and revenue, and as a result, we find ourselves in this big debt problem. Next slide, you can let 18 and move to slide 19. Slide 19 slide 90. Yeah, it's just slide 90. I think the key issues to note here, mainly about the expenditure adjustment, which has been effected in the budget, is just to know that transfers and subsidy component will be receiving the largest share of the adjustment, about 12.3 billion. And the Commission welcome this adjustment, especially to support municipalities as they are key to implementing the responses. Next slide, please. The next slide, again, is just the indication of the adjustment by function. I think here, it's just the indication, which, just to repeat what has already been mentioned by the PBO, is that the social sector, the social development sector, and decent security as well, health will be receiving quite a chunk of the reprioritized allocation, and the Commission acknowledged the importance of these essential frontline sectors indirectly responding to COVID-19 and scaling up and maintaining social assistance interventions to the vulnerable households. I think the main issue that we really want to highlight here is that the Commission is worried of the extent and the modalities of the health adjustment, given the centrality of fighting COVID-19. I will expand on this point in the next slides. Next, please. Here, honorable members, we're just really indicating the share of consolidated expenditure by function. What we're seeing is that the function sees a decrease in its consolidated expenditure. Community development function also experienced a decrease share of consolidated expenditure by 0.5%, and only social development and health function experienced an increase in particular share of consolidated expenditure. Next slide, please. This is probably the most important part of the presentation. Chairperson, I think just to note that the President initially announced that government plans to secure a total of about 130 billion for COVID-19 reprioritization. And in our adjustment budget, we found amount of 109 billion. Of course, this excludes the 8 billion that is also reprioritized from the Skills Development Fund. And of that, national governments contribute about 50% of the reprioritization, followed by provinces with 3% and local government with 12%. The FFC support the thrust of the government prioritization as it closely follows the criteria that we proposed earlier during the presentation to Parliament. However, there are three main concerns that we really noting is that we are continuing to see this repeat prioritization and baseline cuts and subsidies, and that has got implications for the budget structure for municipalities and provinces, as well as the service delivery in the long run, especially if these cuts and reprioritization are not systematic. Provinces have also been left on their own to reprioritize. Of course, this is for decentralization, but at the same time, we may very well find that the extent of the cuts contributes to uneven service delivery between the different provinces. And what again the concern that we also know is that there was a 20 billion that was announced as an injection into local government as part of the fiscal relief package, but in our assessment we only find 11 billion that is currently being given to the local government. There, with the MTPPS coming, we may very likely see the shortfall being also added into the local government baseline. Next slide, please. Next slide. Here is just to indicate the point which I've made earlier about the criteria that the FFC have proposed when government undertakes reprioritization and how government has spent on prioritized budget. So we are happy with the manner in which the reprioritization has been, as it also it's aligned with the I wouldn't go too much into the details. It's just to emphasize the point that it's already made. Now, next slide, slide 25. Slide 25 really is just to highlight re-emphasize the point of reprioritization line counts on the key conditional grants. So in the table, you see that from the 2017-18 budget, we've continued to see extensive reprioritization on major conditional grants up until now. So what this does is that it compounds uncertainty on subnational government in terms of planning and service delivery. So if they are continuous, we continue to see this reprioritization, the compromise and service delivery. As a result, many of the conditional grants will remain unspent because the plans are not really perfect. There's therefore a need for a thorough assessment of the implication of repeated reprioritization on some of the grants on employment, particularly on the effect of this reprioritization on employment, poverty alleviation, rural and urban development, as well as education and health outcomes. Next slide, please. Sorry. The next slide just shows the budget adjustment by vote and which votes actually experience the largest cuts or the largest suspension of the budget. So the main issue here is just to point that the National Department of Tourism and Military will be the most affected by the adjustment. And this is to be expected, especially in the tourism sector. Sorry, Chairperson, I just like to take some water. So the Commission, overall, Commission knows that the reprioritization in departments, in 30 departments, especially the tourism, is welcome, especially in the fact that we are in a, so in any case, those departments are going to find themselves unable to spend the funds which have already been appropriated to them. Next slide, 27, I think we can jump straight to 28. I think on slide 28, again, it's just to reemphasize the point that we've already made, that the Commission knows the grant reprioritization and repurposing is in line with the criteria identified in its presentation to Select Committee on Finances, or on appropriation, sorry. Provinces will be reprioritizing about 20 billion and 7.5 billion will be taken from conditional grants. The main issue we'd like to highlight is that the criteria for reprioritizing the 20 billion is not very clear, as each province will do its own reprioritization given its provincial profile and diseases. So the main issue here, I think, is which is starting to manifest itself is the potential crisis that is in Sui in the Eastern Cape. If we leave the provinces to do this prioritization on their own and not necessarily help, we may find that perhaps Eastern Cape would have to reprioritize even much more of the funding from the provincial equitable share. So that's why we say there's a need some kind of a modality of a framework for provinces to reprioritize. The other issue that we're noting, which we've already spoken to, is the 20 billion which was promised to local government, but we find only 11 billion in the budget. We only find 11 billion in the budget. Yeah, I think that's it. The slide 29 is just to indicate where the money, how the different conditional grants have been prioritized. I wouldn't go into much details. Members can also look at that. Can we go into slide 30? So in slide 30, the Commission really knows the grant will be reprioritized by 77.5 billion rand. The grants where reprioritization was largest are in the Human Settlement Development Grant, the Public Transport Operations Grant, as well as the Provincial Road and Maintenance Grant. So here the main point would really like to reiterate is the previous stance that we made. Caution should be exercised with respect to reprioritization, especially on infrastructure-related grants, so that it does not affect the day-to-day operation of these grants, as well as maintenance and rehabilitation of existing infrastructure. Next slide, please. The next two set of slides just shows where the cuts have been, shows where adjustment has been made on the different conditional grants for provinces and local government. On slide 31, where you see the blue circles indicate the grants where there have been a positive adjustment. In other words, there's been an increase in baseline allocation to those grants. So in the main, the HIV, the TB, and malaria community outreach program will be receiving quite a significant allocation of the reprioritized allocation. The main issue we'd really like to caution here is just the overloading of conditional grants with too many objectives. Already within this very HIV and TB grant, there are almost about 5 windows within the grant. So we just it's just a caution that we shouldn't really be overloading. Rather than allocating the money through the conditional grants, it should rather go through the provincial equitable shares. The next slide, on slide 32, is the same set of slide, but in this case it just shows the local government conditional grants. Just to, as I complete the presentation slide, Chairperson, the next slide on slide 34, looking at the implications for the division of revenue. Here we're just noting that the total interest expenditure, non-interest expenditure of 1.1 billion was stable in February and has been revised upward by 2% to about 1.572 trillion. The budget adjustment has resulted in slight shifts in the division of revenue. National government will account for a larger share of the expenditure reduction, if already mentioned. The bulk of the reprioritized funding is also reallocated to government to support vulnerable households and the health. So overall, the provinces will be carrying the heaviest burden of the expenditure reduction. As you can see on the table below, is that the total share of provincial revenue pool would be increasing from 42.2 to 41%. So that is quite a significant increase in our own view, and given the fact that provinces are still going to have to reprioritize within the provincial equitable share, there's a need now to start focus to look at what the impact of this reduction has on provincial delivery mandates and responsibilities. The next slide, on slide 35. Slide 35 again is just to reiterate the point that we made earlier, that provinces have committed to reprioritize 20 billion from their own from the provincial equitable share, and approximately 75% of the reprioritized budget will be directed at health. So the concern that we really like to highlight there is the absence of a framework to guide provincial reprioritization. There seems to be a blanket approach which have been applied across all provinces. As you can see on the table below, is that the total reprioritized or repurposed amount from the equitable share constitute about 0.0037% across all provinces. But when you look at the impact of COVID-19 across all the provinces, it's not the same. So it's not fair to use this blanket approach when the impact of COVID-19, especially on the health sector across all provinces, is not the same. So there's really a need to really look at this repurposing to make sure that it really responds to the specific circumstances each province is faced with. The next slide, on slide 36. Slide 36 here is just to indicate the composition of the reprioritized funding, reprioritized budget. I think that the PBO has already spoken to this. What is really notable here is that a significant chunk of the reprioritized funding goes towards supporting the vulnerable household for 6 months. We're also seeing healthcare receiving quite a significant chunk of the reprioritized funding. Just as we draw closer to completion, Chairperson, we really want to highlight the following points. Firstly, is that government needs to reconsider the sequencing of the phases for managing the pandemic. So in the adjustment budget, the Minister of Finance announced that the government is going to be looking at 3 phases. First, phase 1, which is to preserve the economy. The phase 2 is about recovery jobs and investment, and phase 3 is about pivoting the economy, which is more about the reforms. So our recommendation here is that support for investment and employment, which is in phase 2, must be underpinned by economic reforms, which is in phase 3, in order to achieve the targeting of the intervention. So it's just to change the sequencing of the interventions so that you're best able to target your responses in the right direction. Secondly, is that the package of reforms must incorporate suitable public sector reforms, especially expenditure reforms, given the conundrum of stagnant revenue, expenditure pressures, and foreseeable low growth trajectory. So we already know that revenue is going to be declining. Recovery may take much more longer, but we still need to spend quite a lot of money for the social service responsibilities. These expenditure reforms that we're talking about really consist of 3 main elements. Firstly, is ensuring that ensuring the sustainability of social spending and public wage bill. You achieve efficiency, expenditure efficiency, but also paying due regard to equity, and also importantly, establishing institutions that promote spending control and enhancing its effectiveness. So you need to strengthen the capacity of the treasuries to make sure that they promote spending control and also enhance the spending effectiveness. The Commission also knows the announcement which was made about the zero-based budgeting, but I think they would like to register the concerns over its effectiveness in changing the budget structure. Particularly looking at the time, the data, the time, and the resource that are required to really operationalize zero-based budgeting. So there are issues there that we think they need to be addressed before we can move full steam ahead in implementing the reform. Next slide. Slide 38. Slide 38. So slide 88, we also note here that there is an urgent need in present to strengthen the institutional capacity of government to disperse relief funds and collate data on beneficiaries. So in the presentation that the PBO made, we've seen that it took quite a time for the relief package to be released into the economy, and with all the delay, you actually exacerbate the extent of the damage in the economy. So there is that institutional capacity that is required to make sure that these funds are released as rapidly as possible to minimize the damage to the economy. There's also a need to outline a clear allocation and eligibility framework for the unallocated 19.6 billion set aside for job creation, which is a key element of phase 2. So in the budget, in the adjustment budget, we noted that there's a 19.66 billion which has been set aside as a provisional allocation, but we are recommending that a clear allocation and eligibility frameworks needs to be made available so that provinces or municipalities know how and to access that fund. Should it be available? There's also a need to reconcile some of the announcements which were made by the president with regard to COVID-19 relief with the adjustment budget, especially the 100 billion that was announced, especially dealing with job creation, and the 20 billion for local government funding. Lastly, it's just the need to outline the business plans for phase 2 that I've spoken to about recovery and job creation, and phase 3 of managing the fiscal through and beyond the COVID-19. In conclusion, I think the point that we really would like to make is that budget adjustment was inevitable in the context of the devastating pandemic. It's slide 39 years. The FFC, the Commission, is in a agreement with government stance on reprioritization as it closely follows its own criteria presented to Parliament. However, the Commission is also concerned with the repeat reprioritization of budgets and the likely impact on the economy and service delivery. So there will be an urgent need to assess the impact of repeat budget reprioritization on the budget structure and delivery of basic services. So this speaks to the whole issue that I think the Commission has made an input earlier about the macro organization of the government. which is really crucial at this point in time. Economic growth stimulation must be really at the center of the debt reduction strategy, since adequate revenue is the largest driver of the burgeoning deficit. Lastly, is just to point that the Commission recommends that tax policy should prioritize fiscal support to ensure that the economy survives the pandemic, because under the current circumstances, increasing tax revenue is not feasible. Is not a feasible policy option. So the minister have already announced that there's going to be perhaps a tax increase requirements over the next over the MTEF. So really, our issue there is that may not be a very feasible policy option given the situation that we find ourselves in, and therefore the tax policy should prioritize fiscal support to ensure the economy survives. We will be increasing taxes. The all spheres of government and management guided by the National Treasury. So provinces and municipalities have already indicated that they're going to experience possible reduction in their own revenue. So against that very possibility, the Commission here is just recommending that the provinces and municipalities must also table the plans for revenue enhancement. And Parliament should receive reports on how provinces has carried out the budget prioritization, given the concerns that we have already raised that there might be some unevenness on the extent to which reprioritization affects the budget structure and also service delivery. Lastly, is just to point out that the reform plans with timelines are needed for each sphere of managing the South Africa out of the pandemic, including the measurement of success. We've already seen quite a number of reports being made about the SOE reforms, but there doesn't seem to be an action following to implement the recommendation of those reports. And I suppose this really just this recommendation is just to make sure that where the plans should be made available to Parliament with timelines so that the Parliament will be able to oversee them and make sure that there's proper implementation. Thank you, Chairperson, for your patience, and thank you to honorable members. That's the end of the presentation.
I'm handing back to you, given the point that you made earlier in the morning. It was in interest of time. So we'll await questions and comments from your honorable members and then respond to it. Thank you.
Thanks. Honorable Karim, where are you? So that we can over the chairing.
Okay, all right. Then members, comments, contributions, over to you.
My hand is up.
Okay, go for it. Who else? I'm just checking my cell phone to see who else here. Okay, go ahead in the meanwhile. So we got Mr. Ryder, Mr. Njadu, Mr. Outcome. Right, go ahead in the meanwhile. Yes, please do, in the order of the initial request and then the following three here. Go ahead, please.
Okay, Chair, thank you so much. The presentation is much appreciated. And maybe one needs to start at the end, where the commissioner ends, and say that indeed I agree with the view of the commission in terms of the repurposing and reduction for provinces, because it's not really according to the impact of COVID-19 in the various provinces. And I'm hoping, therefore, that there will be reconsideration as time goes on, because the allocation could have been according to the sizes of the various provinces, but really the impact of COVID-19 speak a different language altogether. And Chair, there's an area when the commissioner was presenting on slide 23, where he was addressing the three key concerns that need noting under allocation. And I think there he went off a bit in terms of us hearing him. And I would appreciate it if you can go over those just briefly, so that we can have an advantage of having heard it. The budget allocated to the various departments. I think we all need to agree that one of the things that has been done by COVID-19 as well as the lockdown is to really expose us for who we really are in terms of the giants that we have been theorizing about: your poverty, your unemployment, and your inequality. And therefore, much as health is fundamental in terms of carrying the burden of COVID-19, but I think social development is equally important, and therefore it is indeed understandable that a huge chunk be given to social development so that you can be able to allocate the various grants that would alleviate the poverty that is being faced by the country at this point in time. Chair, lastly for me is the issue of the 90 billion. And I just wanted to check in terms of the commission take, the extent that will be covered, bearing in mind that there is a presidential announcement or pronouncement of 100 billion, and now the considered fiscal stimulus seems to be only 95 billion. What could be the impact? Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Next, please. Who's next?
Chair, I'll take the opportunity. Thank you, Dennis Ryder. Thank you very much indeed. Chair, thank you.
Go ahead, Mr. Ryder.
Thank you very much, Chair. Chair, first of all, I want to just say, you know, one 3-hour session for these two presentations is hopelessly inadequate. I think each one would have justified a 3-hour interaction at least on its own. I think there's a lot of useful information that's come out of them. I'd like to limit myself to two, perhaps 3 questions if there's time. The first one relates to slide number 7 on the FFC's presentation, which was kind of glossed over and I think is quite an important one. I want to hone in on exactly or specifically on the last bullet point on slide 7, which refers to, so the heading of the slide is the need for a bolder reform agenda. And the last bullet point says, reviewing of means tests of beneficiaries of government across the board. I'd appreciate if we could just unpack that a little bit more. Are we talking about a move away from kind of a standard, perhaps broad black economic empowerment and going towards a mean test? I think that needs a little bit of information to help us understand it a bit better. I also want to have a look again at slide 26. Again, work through quite quickly, but if one considers the 10 most affected departments or budgets where there've been the biggest cuts, and one has a look, one can see that agriculture is one of the worst affected, agriculture and land reform. Considering the need for food security, I question that. Trade industry is not affected. These are the guys that should be leading us out of the economic problems that we're sitting in. Mineral resources is next. Science is next. Tourism is on there as well. All of these things that are going to take us out of the economic problems that we're sitting in are actually being hammered in terms of the budget that we're allocating to them. And these are not nice to have, because once again, we can't prioritize one or the other. We need to have a balanced approach in terms of lives and livelihoods. I'll leave it at that for now. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, next is Njadu. Are you there?
Yes,
Njadu, are you there?
Thank you very Yes, Chair.
And then,
Good morning.
Willie,
Yeah.
after that.
Thank you, Chair.
And then Dion, yeah. And then Kenny Moroleng. Yes, go ahead.
Chair,
Go
thank you
ahead,
very much.
Mr.
Good morning, members. Chair, thank you very much. Chair, my point will be on the realignment, to make an emphasis on the realignment of the reprivatization, to focus, to be specific on provinces and local government. Because if we look in terms of the presentations, both presentations from PBO and FFC, the issue around local government, municipalities who was unable to collect revenue, and also the education is in the reopening of schools. There are still a number of schools which never reopened because of readiness, and also the issue of health in terms of facilities, the PPEs. So, Chairperson, my point is for the relooked in terms of, I think it's slide 35, which speaks to what we had to relook in terms of my point is local government, education, and health. Because if we look in terms of the increase of the COVID-19 now, are we in line in terms of being able to manage through this crisis? Because we are still in level 3, and we are at the spike now in terms of the COVID-19 increase. So my point, Chairperson, is that we have to relook in terms of specific on local government and provinces when we do the reprivatization. Thank you very much, Chair.
Chair, can I continue?
Yes, Chair.
Chair, this is Willie Oukamp. I'll continue. I was next on the list. Honourable Chair, we are experiencing this crisis at the moment, this disaster, but there has been other disasters that we have been experiencing for quite a long time before we experienced this COVID disaster. In January this year already, the Northern Cape has been declared as a drought disaster area, and shortly thereafter, the whole of the country has been declared as a drought disaster area. I want to continue where Mr. Ryder left off with regards to agriculture and the need for additional funding there. We are sitting in a situation where there's a lot of farmers, commercial farmers, upcoming farmers, small-scale farmers, they just can't make ends meet anymore. And they do not receive help from this government nearly enough for them to survive through this drought. If you go to slide 31, you'll see there's a graph that distinguishes between the allocations in the previous budget and what is now suggested. Now, if you look at provincial disaster relief, you can't even see whether there is a graph there or not. There's nothing. I really think it is important that we must start to really assist our farmers. It will help us with food security. It will help us to do the job creations that we so desperately need in this difficult time. I really think we should look at that and not only do window dressing when it comes to our farmers, but really assist them. There are people that are really in desperate need for help. Thank you, sir.
All right. Now it's, if I'm correct with the secretaries that help, it's Kenny, it's Moroleng, Jordan, Dion, and Moletsane. Okay, is that it? Right, go for it. Thank you.
Chair.
Yes. Who else is it? Who's just interrupted?
I'm on
Sorry?
the lineup. I'm sorry. I'm sorry, Chair. I'm on the lineup. My hand was up.
Fine, no problem. You can go after Moletsane. There's plenty of time. Okay, next. Who's next? It's Kenny.
Well, thank you very much, Chairperson. Well, the first question, Chair, is that the infrastructure drive that is led by the President, how will it be financed? The second question is that the 200 billion loan guarantee scheme doesn't seem to be working because only a fraction of this has been disbursed by the financial services sector. We still think that this was the right way to go about protecting small business. I also want to suggest that the committee should receive a presentation on the Financial Services Sector Code. Thanks, Chair.
Okay, next is Jordan, please. Jordan.
Yes, I'm here. Hello, Chair.
Good. Fine.
I just want to focus in on the raw deal that I think provinces have got in this adjustment budget. You know, much is being made of the fact that municipalities have to cover additional costs, but really those costs are small. The costs of additional police officers or metro police officers, the costs of setting up temporary shelters for homeless people. We understand there are additional costs, but they are relatively small compared to the huge additional costs that provinces have to bear in the health systems and the education systems. And yet municipalities have got quite a big additional allocation and provinces have got zero. In fact, they've got huge cuts in the sense that they have to reprioritize from elsewhere in the budget to fund the health response and the education response. I just wonder, you know, whether that's fair or rational at all, and I want the FFC's comment on that.
Are you done? Okay, then it's Dion, and then Moletsane and Dikeledi.
Thanks, Chair. My question is covered. Thank you.
Okay, good. Moletsane?
Thank you, Chair. Mine is, when I was listening to the presentation, I've heard the commission whereby they were indicating that they welcome the adjustment, especially for the support to municipalities as they are key implementing response to COVID-19, which I fully agree with. But my expectation was that maybe they will go further to advise or to recommend how to the control measures for proper management of the funding. Thank you.
Thank you, Dikeledi.
Thank you, Chairperson. Thank you very much. And let me start by appreciating the two presentations. Chair, I'll start on slide number 29. I'm looking at the recommendations from the FFC, and I want to appreciate that these recommendations, they speak to the challenges that we are facing as a country, not only as a government, but as a country. And it will also speak to our vision 2030, where we will be able to align and oversight whether departments are doing things according to what the government is focusing on. Chair, somebody spoke about the 20 billion for the municipalities, and the presenter, when he spoke, he said of the 20 million, only when they checked, only 15 million is available. And one has questions, and I just want to understand what is the take of the FFC. What could have happened to the 5 million? And in our interactions, I don't know if it was in the House with the relevant ministers of who are in the command center, that they will be working very closely, or Auditor General of South Africa is part of the team to be able to monitor how these funds are utilized, because we are just sick and tired of waiting for people to loot, or people to mismanage, or people to do corruption. And at the end of the day, we just make noise and expose people, nothing is happening. So if they work together throughout the implementation, if there's a red flag, the sooner they identify it, the better, and they act. That will help a lot. Chairperson, I've been covered by most of the issues here, but I want to appreciate what has been presented before us, because it helps us. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dikeledi. Is there anybody else who wants to speak who hasn't yet spoken? Nope. All right, we might have a second round if people care to. Let's move back to PBO and then FFC. Thank you. PBO, please. Who wants to speak on behalf? Yep.
Hello, Chairperson. I think the questions were largely for FFC at the stage.
Yeah, but you don't have any comments, do you?
No, we don't have any comments yet.
All right, okay. Right, over to the FFC team, please.
Thank you, Chairperson. What I'll do, I'm also going to hand over to some of the commissioners to respond, and to Eddie, who's done the presentation. But I thought that there's many of the questions are actually asking for a discussion on realignment and reprioritization. And I'm going to ask Michael Sachs in particular, who's been quite involved in some of this work around prioritization and realignment, to speak to that as the Deputy Chairperson of the FFC. But before we get to that, and then there's also questions that were raised that Trevor Fowler is the person that comes from local government, and Commissioner Kowani and Elizabeth Elsaby Rockman could respond to. But I thought that there was a question that Honourable Gordon Hill was asking about a raw deal for provinces. I think in the previous presentations, and even in this presentation, we as the Commission, we have given a set of criteria as what we think should be applied as a standard of measure in determining how the post-COVID budget should be looked at. And in that criteria, we set a number of conditions for it, and it's also in these slides. So I think what we were trying to do in many ways is to help in an environment of juggling uncertainties, to get to some point of getting certainty as to how the budget ought to move. Clearly, there's been a shift towards health. And part of that responsibility, a major part of that responsibility, has been left to provinces. So when you raise your earlier question to the PBO, I think you're right. We can't actually give a view now until the provinces also table the adjustment budget as to how the provinces actually applied our recommended criteria, but also how the provinces has been shifting funds around to get to health, to be able to deal with a number of pressures that's on the health system. So where it's fair or rational, I think the application of our criteria will allow us to know whether it's happened like that. But clearly in an environment where there's huge economic shocks, huge human and health shocks, there's no fiscal space, or no new fiscal space, if you like. There are questions around where the state's going to get its revenue from. There's a whole debate around how we really look at the state and the state's responsibilities. Low economic growth. I think the reason why the story that we're telling you is not actually buoyant is the environment we find ourselves in. So on that, I think the question of the raw deal, whether it's fair or rational, it depends as to how you see our criteria and how you apply our criteria on it. Then the issue that was raised about the means test, a quick one. I think the point that we're making is that there's a number of mean tests across the country on a number of areas. Huge shocks to households, low to no economic growth, a lack of proper fiscal space, shocks to economic and microeconomic industries. And clearly, there are concerns that we firstly going to deepen and harden poverty levels, and secondly, we're going to create further inequality, and thirdly, it's going to be a struggle for new economies and all the current economies to be pulled up by the bootstraps. And as a result, there's a need to look at especially whether the means test that we currently have in the different areas are still applicable relative to the time it was designed, developed, and implemented. Social assistance comes to mind, and other support programs, especially around the social wage, comes to mind around that in terms of government. So that's the reason why it's been raised. The issue on the agriculture, can I just say, we've raised this before, and we think our view was, Honourable Ryder and Honourable members will remember that we did say that there is a need to look at the importance of agriculture as a contributory industry to the economy, but also the challenges of food availability and food security. And I think the intervention that's been made in many ways suggests that the uncertainties goes beyond where we think the effects is going to be felt across the country. So there's a need to further look at that. But it's also a need to start thinking about how do we bring the what is referred to, and I don't like the term, but it's a term that we use. You know, it's always development workers or development players. Now we're having emerging farmers relative to commercial farmers. And I think that's a key conversation that needs to be held as to how's there shared value between bringing commercial and emerging farmers together, especially looking at blended financing, common approaches, shared value in terms of those areas that look at food security and food availability. Chair, with that, can I ask the commissioner, starting with Commissioner, the Deputy Chairperson, Michael Sachs, and the other commissioners to answer, and then we ask Eddie to close on some of the questions and comments that were raised. Please, Chairperson.
Okay. Welcome back, Michael, in your new role. Michael, are you there?
Yes, I'm here, Chairperson. Thank you. I'm not sure exactly which question I must answer, to be honest. But let me say that I think we all need to approach the reallocations that have taken place in the following sense, that this is really about...
Just one thing. I get harassed by the ICT people. You have to put your video on when you speak, okay? For the YouTube and so on. Michael? Hello? Can somebody else, Michael, to connect?
Yeah, I'm here. Probably, as you can see, not very well. And I have some 4-year-old child that's running around me, but let me try and say the reallocation, I think we have to approach it in a pragmatic way. This is the first attempt to reallocate. We will be getting another adjustment budget, of course, in October. And I think so we shouldn't see the decisions or the budgets that have been presented to Parliament as a kind of a final cut based on some kind of rational assessment, but rather a pragmatic attempt to respond to the immediate needs of shifting budget around. And I think that Parliament should engage with the details with a view to also seeing what else can be shifted later in the year. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Who's next? Daniel? Daniel, unmute yourself, please.
Sorry, Chair, I thought Trevor, Rockman, and Kowani and Aubrey Makari wanted to comment before Eddie comes in. Okay. Trevor?
Yeah, Trevor, we welcome back in your new role.
Thank you, Honourable Chair. And it's good to work with colleagues that I've worked with so many years ago. There are just a couple of issues. The one raised by Honourable Hill about municipalities. I think the key issue that is being overlooked is that the equitable share in certainly the large municipalities and the metros is a relatively small amount, and that what is not indicated here in the budget is the impact that would the loss of revenue, which has happened to national government, will also happen to municipal government. So it's so I think you have to look at it in a balanced way that looks at that particular issue. And the second question is that when you look at social services, there are studies done that show that the social services, unfortunately, in places like the Eastern Cape and even in Limpopo, are concentrated around the large cities like PE and Polokwane. And when I say social services, I mean the employees are located there and not located throughout the province. So it means that there's greater emphasis on the urban areas, and some of the rural areas would not receive the adequate social services that may be required. So the second point, which is made in the presentation, is that there's a need to ensure that when the provinces and the municipalities reprioritize, that there's support from National Treasury and national government and provincial government to ensure that this is done in a way that is equitable and fair. I think those would be really the two key issues. The third one, which I want to close on, is that the support that is being provided by social services have reached new recipients that were not reached prior to the COVID-19 pandemic. And what has to be taken into account into the future is that once you've given support to poverty-stricken individuals and families, you cannot take it away. And so that allocation will have to continue over a period of time. If you take it away, there will be a social backlash from the society saying that you are now taking away from the poor. So it's an important thing that needs to be taken into account in the budget, that in the future, some of this will have to remain. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Who's next from the FFC? Yes.
Rahman, we wanted to say something. Is it Kowani? Are you there?
Thank you, Chairperson. Thank you, Chair. Maybe I can just emphasize 2 points. The one is we must keep in mind that there will be life after the immediate crisis, and it's important for us to begin to gear ourselves to plan on how we go beyond the current phase to phase 2 and phase 3. Investment in employment will be phase 2, phase 3 will be economic reforms. And I think the emphasis of the Commission is that we need to have much firmer timeframes and actual plans, concrete plans on how to take some of these issues forward in phase 2 and phase 3. And the second point was on revenue enhancement, that we should go beyond our traditional sources and our traditional default, where we look at, in all spheres of governments, an increase in rates, taxes, license fees, and so forth, because those would not be adequate sources to tap into because of the impact on the economy, the job losses. People will simply not have that money available to be able to cope with increased rates and taxes, for example. So there's a need to be very creative, and the work should start now in all spheres of government to have actual plans and thinking out of the box going forward. And I think the points on the effect on agriculture and land reform and the drought and disaster, those are serious issues that the committee itself must also take into consideration when considering its final position on this adjustment budget. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, please.
I'm not sure whether Commissioner Kowani or Makari wanted to say something.
It's Kolwane.
Welcome back. Yes, in your new role as well, I see. Yeah?
Thank you. Probably I will take a point. The first point, which has been raised by Honorable Mahlangu, around the issue of, because there is a silent point which she made there, to say how do we look in terms of this reallocation vis-a-vis our own projection on what we said we will be achieving around 2030 and so on in terms of our own national development plan, so that we don't lose that, so that we can be able to start now to mitigate in terms of what this pandemic is going to impact on us in order to achieve that particular goals and so on. But coupled to that is the matter which raised by Honorable Ryder around the budget cuts on slide on advertisement resources. So on. Is that probably is the issue that work yourselves, honorable members, on how best do we manage this issue of spending? Because yes, indeed, you can see where budget are cuts, but even if budget are not cuts, sometimes the spending by various departments does not come forth in order to exhaust those budgets and so on. I think the practical planning or planning in terms of a real plan where you put money in order to spend becomes much important. But I'm sure it's a matter that needs to be looked into. But bearing in mind that even if you throw money to some of the areas, that budget, sometimes they're not spent and so on. Maybe it's them go back and look into that and how best to monitor that particular situation so that as we talk about this reprioritization of budgets, we don't lose sight of the spending, including the monitoring and where this budget are used for and so on, as raised by the other members, so that you don't get some of this budget maybe misuse on other areas and so on. I think those are the 2 points, Chair, which I just wanted to take on. Thanks very much.
Aubrey Makari.
Any Commissioner?
Commissioner Aubrey Makari, are you there?
Okay, Prof, it's asked here by.
Can I?
Go ahead.
Can I ask
Are you there?
Eddie, yeah, Chairperson, can I ask that Eddie Rakabe answer all the other points that have been outstanding? Eddie, please.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks, Chairperson. I think quite a lot of the questions have been covered. It's just didn't get it quite correct.
We can't hear you, right? At least I can't. I hope others can.
Can you see me now? Yeah. Yeah, the questions that was asked about the 95 billion.
So fine, go ahead. Is to get this done, yeah.
Okay. I think it's my rather switch off my speed because. Hello. Yeah, the 100 billion that we were, yeah, the point that we're making about the 100 billion there was just that was just to highlight the whole issue of realigning what the president says and what eventually manifests in the budget. So the 130 billion reprioritized was announced as part of the COVID-19 relief interventions. What we're saying, we're seeing 100 billion, but I think from what the Commissioner Sachs has said is that because we are only dealing now with the what it's called a supplementary budget, which shouldn't necessarily be seen as a final adjustment for the year. Perhaps with the MTVS still coming, we may very well see some of the funding or the shortfall funding flowing in. So I think that's the safest point to say on that. And then the issue of the infrastructure, how is it going to be funded? So we're noting there again is that, and this has been happening for quite a while, is that every time there is reprioritization, the infrastructure grants will be really hard hit by this reprioritization, which is understandable sometimes because there is a lot of underspending on infrastructure grant. But it also has got implications obviously for future growth and recovery. But we've also seen recently that the president has announced the sustainable infrastructure development projects. So the head of the infrastructure in the presidency held a symposium recently where some of the key infrastructure projects were identified, and some of the key infrastructure financiers were also invited to come and bid for those infrastructure projects. So gradually, we're probably going to see more infrastructure away from the fiscus to into more.
Anything can be done, Secretariat, to assist to make this clearer. If it's breaking and it's fuzzy and we can't follow the sentences fully, although one can pick up reasonably, I think, what the gentleman's saying. But can anybody help? Hello? Daniel? Can we come back to Eddie? Is anybody else outside wants to speak? Yeah. In Kululeko, can you help Eddie offline, please, man, so that you can hear him?
Yes,
Daniel, anybody else? Yes. From your side who wants to respond?
I think that covers it because the presentation also cleared some of the issues. Thank you.
All right. There's a question put to Professor. There's most of you. I think it's to you, Daniel. It's asked by Willie. His question is, what is the reason why there are not sufficient or additional money made available to mitigate the drought? Do you want to respond to that?
Chairperson, I can't hear you.
What's that, Daniel?
I see your face, but I can't hear a thing, so I don't know what you're saying. Maybe one of the other commissioners. I'm just talking now because I think that you can. I don't know whether one of the researchers or the commissioners want to answer you because I can't hear you.
Okay, read the meeting chat. Okay, are any of the FFC people able to hear me? The question is, what is the reason why there are not sufficient or additional money made available to mitigate the drought? Can anybody hear that?
I'm hearing you perfectly.
Yes, Chair, we can hear.
So the issue isn't on my side, it's on Daniel's side, presumably. Look, colleagues can use the meeting chat so that we can get clarity on whether people are able to hear me at least. Eric Colwane, can you say you can hear me clearly, right?
Yes, I can hear you, Chair.
In Kululeko, can you hear me clearly, Alan?
Very clear, Chair.
Yes, Chair. All right, so you the question, please, on the drought from Willie Outcomes. Michael? Anybody else? Sorry.
Chairperson, if
Michael?
I may.
Yes, please do. Who is this? Is it Elizabeth?
No, this is Kay. I'm the CEO of the FFC.
Yeah, please.
Just a quick answer.
Can you switch your camera on, please? Because I'm being harassed by the ICT people. There we are. Go for it, please.
My camera is on.
Yes,
thanks, Chairperson.
We can see you.
So just a quick response on that is that in responding to the COVID crisis, one of the immediate responses was to look at the conditions, etc., related to the drought relief funding, and as such to enable the COVID response even ahead of this particular adjustments budget, which obviously we know is not the final one. And so some of that funding has already then been allocated and being used for the COVID response. And I think we need to look at the MTBPS time at what the further responses will be in terms of the drought relief funding, and whether or not some of the unallocated funding currently perhaps is just being kept aside so that there can be a response to the COVID and also to other disasters. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Are there any outstanding questions that haven't been? No. Chair, any members want to raise from the committees? No. Am I right, Nkululeko? There are any more questions?
Just to
No
say,
more
I'm
hands.
excited.
Chairperson.
Right, Dikeledi, go for it. Dikeledi is on the speakerphone. Go ahead.
Chairperson, I've got nothing to raise except to say that you and I were happy to see Eric Kolwani Skumbuzo to be part of the team. Welcome, Mr. Kolwani.
Yeah.
I'm excited.
Except in my case, there's no provincial or regionalistic undertone here.
You
are
happy.
And Dikeledi comes from. Okay, so colleagues, no more questions. No more comments. Right. Yeah.
No, Chair, I think it's
Chairperson.
It's just to say, Chair,
Yes,
I think the question was well responded. Well responded, Chairperson, and I think I'm covered.
Hello, Chairperson.
All right. Well, that's done. Then
People want to give a comment.
Sorry.
Hello, Chairperson.
Who will that be?
PBO Siraj will give a comment just now.
Ah, yes. You want to say something after all? Oh, all right. Go ahead.
Yes, Chair. I hope you can hear and see me clearly.
Well, certainly
the PBO.
I can hear. I can see you though, unless you put your camera on. Now I can see you.
My camera is on. Thank you, Chair.
Yeah, you.
Seeing that there's time left,
It's
the
hard to
PBO.
recognize anyway. That's Siraj there, right?
Yes, that's me. With the
Under
big
all that
beard.
hair. Yeah.
Yes, yes, Chair. Thank you, Honourable Chair. Since the PBO hadn't had time to finish our presentation and there's time left, I was wondering if the Chair would allow us to present a few more slides.
Yeah, well, if the committee is fine with that, I will give you 5 minutes or so, because I think the basic drift of what you've said, you've covered. But okay, 5 minutes more if you want it. Go ahead.
Okay. I'm going to put up our presentation. Sorry, Chair. Can people see the slides?
Not
Okay.
yet. Meanwhile, speak to it.
Okay. So
meanwhile,
okay.
Here we are. It's on now.
If we can, whoever's managing the slides, if we can move to slide 40, please.
I have my own.
Okay, thank you. So a lot of the presentation so far has dealt with the reprioritization and those issues. One of the big things that was in the minister's speech and in the special budget review was linked to the outlook, especially looking towards the medium-term budget policy statement and the what's coming forward. And mentioned there was a move towards a primary surplus by 23-24 and cut in expenditure of 230 billion. And so a lot of these slides, and these are slides that I wanted PBO to add into its presentation, was related to saying that we should be cutting this soon towards a cutting budget. We have uncertainty about the impact of the and in South Africa themes in our presentations to the committees and especially appropriations committee, division of lack of access to basic services, water and presentation. We also talk about food security and that those are going to be increasing problems going forward, and the poor are being especially hit. So as I think FFC said in their presentation, there shouldn't be a shift too quickly towards fiscal consolidation and cutting that, and that we need, as the slide says, measures to save current and future generations. And this slide responds to the concern that National Treasury has put in the SBR, talking about the concern for intergenerational equity. And one of the things we want to say is that we don't deal with the problems faced by the current generation. And we mentioned earlier in our presentation, for instance, a 1-year-old after 5 weeks can face serious malnutrition and stunting with lifelong implications. We're looking at future generations also being affected by the decisions that we make now. And one of the things we're also saying then is that we should look at more new if resources are allocated. Consider, one of the FFC commissioners said we can't look at, for instance, property rates and these things, but we should look at the possibility of wealth and income capital gains, especially for people in the top 0.5% of the earnings in terms of income wealth. We should towards a principle that rentier incomes, especially in financial markets, and people with businesses with licenses and mineral rights who are more able to afford it, taxed more efficiently and more urgently with illicit capital flight, base erosion, and profit shifting, and then also to move towards looking at the entire balance sheet of government, and here looking at the use of PIC funds, including, as Michael Sachs has suggested in a paper recently, that a payment holiday to the GPF be considered, and then also looking at new borrowing and consider sources directly, for instance, from the South African Reserve Bank, which is we debate, and we're not raising this as a recommendation for PBO, but we think that it is an important debate within the country, and we're seeing more and more countries across the world shift to move to this. If you can move 2 slides ahead, please. Now, I'm going to end with this one so that I don't take up too much extra time, and I'm sure there may be questions and comments to go. When we're looking at this 230 billion expenditure and a shift towards a primary surplus in the medium by 23-24. And one of the questions that's really important for us is to raise is, what does it mean when a government runs a primary surplus? A primary surplus means that other than the interest payments, government expenditure has to be less than its revenue. In other words, government takes more money from the private sector than it puts into the private sector in terms of its spending and investment. What does that mean for the private sector? Government invests less in providing and maintaining infrastructure and essential services. Households and businesses spend more to make up for the lack of government provision. Poor households, particularly in rural areas and townships, have fewer and lower quality services. Example, many going without water, in homes and schools. Women are forced to spend more time doing unpaid labor in the household, and as we know, women do an unfair extra share of household labor that's unpaid and not. That's a very large customer to many businesses, including SMEs, buys less, causing lower levels of production in businesses and the whole economy, which means that businesses end up with higher costs. In many sectors, they rely on economies of scale, but also the services provided by government and infrastructure, better roads, better access to markets, affects the cost structure of companies. And so companies end up with smaller revenue and lower profits, also to less investment and employ fewer people in that situation. Unemployed people and discouraged work seekers have even less access to jobs if they're in that kind of situation. And SMEs and entrepreneurs have less access to markets and less possibility to actually launch new businesses and build existing businesses because of the constraints and the increased difficulty in actually making those businesses profitable in that kind of situation. So government borrowing for spending and investment does not crowd out private investment, but it can crowd in private investment, especially in this kind of serious downturn and disaster where you end up with a lot of people unemployed, lots of excess capacity in business organizations. Government spending actually is something that ends up, earlier we used the word an anchor within the economy. So thank you for the opportunity to present some of our extra slides, Chair. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Okay. Any comments, contributions, questions? Are there none? In Kululeko, Alan, you don't pick up any members wanting to put any questions. Then I'll ask, well, let me just say firstly, before I come to the co-chair, that, it seems that contrary to what's been suggested, that 3 hours is not enough, it turns out that it's time enough, really, for us to cover the issues. This may be related to the fact that in Kululeko, are we supposed to aren't we supposed to see slides off the screen? Alan?
Sorry, that's my fault.
Yeah, because now the ICT people will contact me. The co-chair will draw the meeting to a close. Joe, are you around? Joe?
Yes, I'm here.
Yeah, but before you do, on my screen, I can see somebody, it says HA here. I don't know if that's the screen everybody sees right now. Is that correct? Is that how it's meant to be, Alan?
That's what I see as well. Is your camera on?
Mine, certainly, yes. In fact, you can see me at the bottom.
See you, Chair.
Yeah, well, you can see my head at least, right? I don't know. I'm not a technical person. It's not my responsibility, Alan, to handle this. But, I keep getting these messages about, having to show a screen with the person speaking. So as long as the ICT people know this is not my doing. Okay, Alan, can you sort this out? Yeah, you sort that out. And meanwhile, we can't hold up the meeting. As long as you can hear me, colleagues, you can hear me, right? So if you can't, you'll put a note in the meeting chat. So let me put this to you, that look, we're fine with the time allocated. And secondly, maybe related to the fact, colleagues, that, in this very unprecedented, what shall we say, uncertain, unpredictable, volatile situation, there are no easy answers. Not from the experts we engage with, like this morning, or civil society activists, or us as parliamentarians or the government. And I think we need to be modest about, about our views across all political parties and what's possible. The second thing I wanted to say was that I think it's correct for us to put questions to the PBO and the FFC, but also, ultimately, we can hear their views, but it's our responsibility as MPs, these 4 committees in particular, to find the answers, actually, after engaging with the experts, technical experts. So it's not enough just to put questions, colleagues. We need to actually come up with some answers, especially as our report will contain recommendations next week. And I take it the support team will do the original draft. Will actually take into account the questions, at least that the members have raised. So these are our concerns. And you know, we need to find answers that only ourselves, not the support team, can offer. Tentative those answers may be on how we go forward. Finally, Comrade Joe, I think we must, obviously, I'm sure you share this view with me and perhaps the whole committee, or most of us, if not almost all of us, that we welcome the new appointments. Daniel, it's strengthening the FFC. You've got a very good team drawn in, and we thank the minister and the government and whoever does for appointing such a team. Co-chairperson Joe Maswangani will now draw the meeting to a close. Thank you.
Eunice. Hello.
It looks like the chair is driving, Comrade Eunice. Maybe you must close.
I'm not driving. I'm seated here.
That echo.
He's seated in the bundles. He's seated in the bundles.
Rural area.
No. Malamlele is not as rural as Butterworth and all those areas of Eastern Cape.
And Kwamhlang.
Kwamhlanga is in Tshwane. I mean, you are urban there. Njandu, can you hear me?
I can hear you. I can see you even, very clear.
What about some? Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Chairperson, Comrade Eunice, honorable members, commissioners, PBO, staff of Parliament, and other participants. As Comrade Eunice has indicated, I think what we have to do, Co-Chair, is that we should not treat these presentations by PBO and FFC like academic articles. These are serious stuff. They have done a lot of work in this regard to the issue of budget. Both the presentations I have picked up that they raise very critical issues. The issue of corruption, improving governance, reducing high levels of concentration of the economy, land reform and agriculture, food security, reducing the cost of broadband, and strengthening the capacity of the states. They also go on to suggest that as Parliament, we should invite provinces to present, not only provinces, they say all spheres, including local government. I think that can be done through SALGA, to make a presentation on the revenue enhancement and expenditure management plans. I think we have to do that, Chairperson, that at some stage we engage SALGA. We have seen the figures in terms of revenue reduction, starting from SARS down up to the lowest level of municipalities. If we don't do so, the 20 billion rand set aside for municipalities surely will be a drop in the ocean. Already, municipalities are beginning to face very serious financial difficulties. And it is also up to them to come to Parliament and make a presentation as to how do they want to reprioritize their expenditure and also revenue enhancement plans. Also coupled to that will be provinces. I think at some stage we'll have to meet chairpersons of finances in provinces and MECs responsible for finances to deal with the provincial reprioritizations. And the other key issue that has been raised is the SOE reform plans. As much as we are not a portfolio committee on DPE, but we are portfolio committees or standing and select committees responsible for finances. We are equally also allowed to can receive a presentation either from DPE or the combination of DPE and Treasury in regard to SOE's reform plans. In quite a number of occasions, we have dealt with this issue of SOEs and is coming back in the two presentations. So I think concretely, Chairperson, we have to leave this meeting with a clear way forward, because another issue that has been raised more often is that presentations that come from FFC in particular, in most cases, it's like Treasury does not take them serious. And FFC derives its existence from the Constitution. It's not a by-the-way structure which somebody has to accommodate somewhere. It has got a life of its own, and their recommendations have to be taken very, 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 very serious. So I would like that the Secretariat should assist us in expunging out from the two presentations as to what are the issues that are concretely recommended that as finance committees of Parliament, we have to take them forward. Thanks very much, PBO and FFC. And lastly, I think members have received a very tight schedule in regard to our program. Starting from today, tomorrow is Wednesday, public hearings, Friday's response by National Treasury, Tuesday's consideration and adoption of committee report. So we have got a very quiet schedule before us, and I hope we are going to cope with the pressure. But in conclusion, Chairperson, I would like to thank all the participants, and as I have indicated or alluded to, that let's pick up critical issues from the two presentations and develop a plan of action so that it should not be like when we meet PBO and FFC, it's like just a workshop. This is not just a workshop. We are dealing with very, very critical issues, and we'll have to find a way of implementing recommendations put before us here. Thanks very much. Baya danke. Siyathokoza. Ikhensini ndiyabulela. Enkosi.
Enkosi Salo.
Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you.
Long live the
PS.
Long live the
Long
Chair.
live PS. Long live my PS. My weave. My weave.
You must.
Thank you very much. Good day, Chairperson.
I must do what?
Nijani la Eastern Cape.
Yo, Salo.
Eastern Cape out is
Minister must see your face.
Yo,
Since that time, I don't show my face anymore. He made me blush. He made me blush and became embarrassed.
You are not used to compliments, Dix. Come on.
I'm too old for that. Some people will interpret.
Why?
And he's.
If you say that, what should I?